$347,000. That's what I calculated one night at 2 in the morning, sitting at my kitchen table in Cleveland with a calculator and a stack of bank statements going back to 2020. $347,000 in time, in labor, in groceries, in medical supplies, in co-pays, in the wear on my knees and the cartilage in my lower back, in the sleep I didn't get, in the retirement I deferred, in the life I put on pause. That number doesn't include what she stole. That part comes later. But I want you to hold that figure in your mind, because everything I'm about to tell you sits on top of it, like a house built on someone else's bones. My name is Raymond Okonkwo. I'm 61 years old. I spent 28 years as a paramedic in Cuyahoga County, and I've been a widower for 9. I live in a duplex on the east side of Cleveland, the kind of street where the driveways are cracked, but the lawns are cut, where people still wave from the porch and the mailman knows your name. I moved my father into the other half of that duplex in the spring of 2020, right when the world shut down, right when his COPD shifted from manageable to terminal, right when it became clear that somebody was going to have to give up their life so he could keep his. And I was the somebody. I'd always been the somebody. Let me tell you about my mornings. 4:45, alarm goes off. Not because I had somewhere to be, I was retired by then, but because my father's first nebulizer treatment needed to happen at 5:15. And before that, I had to check his oxygen levels, record them out loud with the date and time so my phone would capture the audio, then prepare his morning medications, 7 pills sorted into a weekly organizer I refilled every Sunday night. I'd make his breakfast, oatmeal with a little brown sugar and sliced banana if his appetite was decent, or a protein shake if it wasn't. I photographed every meal, before he ate it and after. That probably sounds strange to you, and it sounded strange to my sister too. She used to joke about it. She'd say, "Raymond and his filing cabinet. You'd think he was still on the rig documenting a run." She said it like it was funny, like it was a quirk. I want you to remember that she said that, because that filing cabinet is the reason I'm free, and she's not. My father was a good man. Ezekiel Okonkwo, 89 years old when he died, born in Lagos, raised his family in Cleveland, worked 31 years at the Ford plant in Brook Park. He had hands like leather gloves and a laugh that started in his stomach. When I was a boy, maybe 10 or 11, he used to shoot hoops with me in the driveway. He was terrible at it. Couldn't dribble to save his life, but he'd play me one-on-one and let me win, and he never once made it obvious. He'd go for a layup and just barely miss. He'd take a shot and hit the rim instead of the net. He made losing look like trying. I didn't understand until I was much older that love sometimes means pretending to lose so someone else can feel strong. When his COPD advanced, I didn't think twice. That man let me win for years. The least I could do was make sure he could breathe. So I built a system. 28 years as a paramedic trained me to document like my license depended on it, because it did. I kept a spreadsheet cross-referenced with every one of his medical appointments. I logged every vital sign reading. I had the pharmacy counter sign his prescription logs. I saved every text message about care decisions, every email, every voicemail. I photographed his wound care. I recorded his oxygen readings aloud. 1,247 consecutive days of documentation. I didn't do it because I thought I'd need to defend myself. I did it because that was how I knew the care was right. That was how I'd been trained to protect people. The first 2 years, my sister Valerie called every couple of weeks. She lives in Chicago. She's 49, owns a salon on the north side, does well for herself. She'd call and ask how Dad was doing, and I'd give her the update. And she'd say something like, "You're a saint, Raymond. I don't know how you do it." And then the call would end, and I wouldn't hear from her for another 14 days. She came to Cleveland quarterly, 4 times a year. And every time she came, she brought catered meals and a photographer. I'm not exaggerating. She had someone with a camera taking pictures of her sitting at my father's bedside, holding his hand, smoothing his blanket. She posted them on her lifestyle blog. She posted them on her salon's Instagram. Hashtag family first, hashtag daddy's girl, hashtag blessed. She'd stay for maybe 6 hours. Then she'd hug Dad, hug me, get in her rental car, and drive to the airport. And I'd go back to the nebulizer schedule and the wound care and the 4:45 alarm. That was the pattern. And I accepted it. I accepted it because I believed something about myself that I'm only now beginning to question. I believed that being the one who showed up was its own reward. I believed that love was labor, and labor was love, and that keeping score was beneath me. I believed my sister was busy and successful, and that her time was structured differently than mine. I made excuses for her absence the way you make excuses for weather. It just was what it was. Then, in the fall of 2021, I got a letter from the VA. My father was a veteran. He had benefits. Those benefits were supposed to deposit directly into his checking account, which I managed because he couldn't see well enough to read a bank statement anymore. The letter was a confirmation of an address change for correspondence. The new address was in Chicago. I recognized the zip code. It was Valerie's. I sat with that letter at my kitchen table, and my hands did something they hadn't done since my first year on the ambulance. They shook. Not a lot. Just enough that I couldn't hold the paper still. I set it down and pressed my palms flat on the table, and I could hear the oxygen concentrator running in the next room. That steady mechanical hum that had become the heartbeat of my house. And I thought, maybe it's a mistake. Maybe she updated the address for some legitimate reason. Maybe there's an explanation. I called the VA the next morning. There wasn't an explanation. Someone had called pretending to be me and changed the direct deposit. The caseworker left me a voicemail that I've listened to probably 50 times since then. She said, "Someone called pretending to be you and changed the direct deposit. This happens more than you'd think in families." That sentence. This happens more than you'd think in families. I felt my whole chest cave when I heard it, because it meant there was a category for what was happening to me. It meant other people had sat at other kitchen tables and felt this exact same thing. And it meant my sister knew how to do this, because people like her always know how to do this. The missing funds totaled $68,000. 4 years of my father's VA benefits rerouted to an address in Valerie's name, funding her salon business while I was buying his medical supplies out of my own retirement savings. When I saw the VA redirect confirmation, I understood why she always joked about my filing cabinet. She wasn't laughing at a quirk. She was measuring a threat. I need to tell you about the next part carefully because it came in layers, and each layer was worse than the one before it. Thanksgiving that year. The extended family gathered at my Uncle Carlton's house in Detroit. I drove up with Dad, which was an ordeal, because traveling with a portable oxygen setup takes planning most people can't imagine. Valerie was there. She hugged me at the door. She said, "You're doing God's work. I could never handle this." She brought a home-cooked meal, sweet potato casserole in a glass dish, and she set it on the table, and she looked at me with genuine warmth, and I felt like I was standing next to a stranger wearing my sister's face. That evening, her husband Frank stood up during dessert. Frank, who I'd known for 12 years, who I'd helped move furniture when they bought their house, Frank looked at the family and said, "We're just glad Dad has people checking on him, because Raymond keeps him pretty isolated. Doesn't want witnesses, I guess, to how things really are over there." He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather. And the table went quiet, and people looked at me, and I saw something in their eyes I'd never seen before. Doubt. I didn't say anything. I swallowed the response I'd composed in my head, which was detailed and sharp, and would have started a war in my uncle's dining room. Instead, I felt my throat close and my jaw tighten, and I looked down at my plate, and I let it pass. That silence cost me something I can still feel in my molars when I think about it, like I'd been grinding my teeth for hours. Later, my Uncle Carlton called me from Detroit. He said, "Ray, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." He said Valerie had told him I had a drinking problem, that I shouldn't be around oxygen tanks, that she was worried about Dad's safety. I held the phone and listened to my uncle, a man who'd known me my entire life, ask me if I was a danger to my own father, and the oxygen concentrator hummed in the next room like it always did. And outside, it was starting to snow, and I realized that Valerie wasn't just taking money. She was building a case. She was constructing a version of me that didn't exist, distributing it to everyone who mattered, and she was doing it systematically. 2 weeks before my father died, he told me something that only made sense after I opened the chaplain's envelope. He grabbed my wrist while I was adjusting his cannula, and he looked at me with those clouded eyes, and he said, "You stayed." Just that. You stayed. And I said, "Of course I stayed, Dad." And he shook his head, slowly, like I didn't understand. And he said, "No, you stayed." There's a nurse coordinator named Darnell Price. He managed my father's hospice team for the last 14 months. Darnell came to the house twice a week, and he saw everything. The clean sheets, the medication logs, the meals, the wound care. He saw me holding my father's hand during bad nights. When the breathing got so labored, it sounded like something tearing. When Darnell first suggested I might need help, not with Dad, but with what was happening around me, I was evasive. I didn't want to involve outsiders in family business. That's how I was raised. You handle it inside. But Darnell saw the VA letter on my counter one afternoon, and he said, "Raymond, I know what this is. And you need to stop thinking like a son and start thinking like a paramedic. Document, document, document." I almost laughed. I pointed at the filing cabinet. And he said, "Good. Now get a lawyer." That was the moment. Not dramatic, not cinematic. A hospice nurse standing in my kitchen pointing at a filing cabinet and telling me to get a lawyer. That was where it turned. My son Jordan came to see me a few weeks later. Jordan is 27, lives in Columbus, works in IT. Good kid. Quiet, like me. He sat on my couch and he was fidgeting, pulling at a thread on his sleeve, and finally he started crying. And he said, "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I'm so sorry." He said Valerie had offered to pay off his student loans, every cent, if he would file a statement saying I'd lost my temper with Grandpa. She wanted him to say he'd witnessed me being aggressive. She wanted documentation of abuse, manufactured from my own son. Jordan didn't do it. He came to me instead. But I want you to understand what that means. She tried to buy my child. She tried to turn my son into a weapon, and the amount she offered him was less than what she'd already stolen from our father's VA benefits. She was spending his money to destroy me. That night I opened the filing cabinet and I started organizing. Not adding to it, I'd been adding to it every day for years. Organizing, sorting, cross-referencing. 28 years of training kicked in, and I became a paramedic again, running the biggest call of my life. Patient, my father's dignity. Mechanism of injury, my sister's greed. Treatment plan, evidence. I hired an elder care attorney named Miriam Chen. The first time she sat down with my documentation, she went through 3 binders in silence. Then she looked up and said, "This is prosecutable, and she knows it." I asked her what she meant by, "She knows it." Miriam said people who go this far, the VA fraud, the character assassination, the beneficiary changes, they do it because they've calculated that no one is keeping records. They count on the caregiver being too exhausted to fight, too buried in bedpans and medication schedules to notice the money disappearing. Your sister, Miriam said, made one miscalculation. She forgot you were a paramedic. The life insurance change was the detail that broke something in me. I found it on a Tuesday afternoon. My father's policy, the one that had named me as beneficiary for 20 years, had been changed 3 months prior. I was removed entirely. Valerie's children were now the beneficiaries. The change was dated the week after my father's worst hospitalization, the one where we thought we'd lose him, the one where I slept in a chair next to his bed for 4 nights because his breathing was so fragile I was afraid to close my eyes. My ears started ringing the moment I saw her signature on that beneficiary form. Not a metaphor. Actual ringing, like a flashbang had gone off in my skull. She had visited that week. She'd brought flowers and sat with him for an hour, and then she must have driven straight to the insurance office. If you're keeping track, here's the ledger. $68,000 in redirected VA benefits. A life insurance policy changed without consent. Attempted witness tampering with my son. A slander campaign across the extended family. And then, the final move. Valerie petitioned for emergency conservatorship over my father. She alleged that I had been withholding pain medication, that I was selling his prescriptions. She filed it in Cuyahoga County Probate Court, and the hearing was set for 18 days out, and my father was actively dying, and I had 18 days to prove that everything she'd told the world about me was a lie while keeping a dying man comfortable and breathing. I almost got caught once. Valerie showed up unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, said she was in town for a salon conference, which I knew wasn't true because I'd checked. She walked into my kitchen, and the VA fraud documents were spread across my table. I hadn't expected her. My mouth went dry, and I felt the adrenaline hit my bloodstream the way it used to on bad calls, that cold electric feeling in the center of your chest. And I said, "Let me clear this off. I was doing taxes." She glanced at the papers. She looked at me, and for a moment her eyes were calculating something, measuring whether what she was seeing was a threat. Then she smiled and said, "You and your paperwork, Raymond." She went in to see Dad for 20 minutes and left. That night I moved everything to Miriam's office. Darnell, the hospice chaplain, had been acting strange for a few weeks. Evasive when I asked about my father's conversations. Looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. I wondered if Valerie had gotten to him too. I wondered if the one professional who'd seen my care up close was going to be turned. But Darnell wasn't being evasive because he'd been compromised. He was being evasive because my father had given him something to hold, and he'd been asked to keep it secret until it was safe. I didn't know that yet. That came later. The conservatorship hearing was on a Wednesday morning. Cuyahoga County Probate Court, 3rd floor, courtroom with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Valerie sat at the petitioner's table in a navy blazer and pearl earrings. She looked composed, professional. She looked like a woman who ran a successful business and was concerned about her elderly father's welfare. Her attorney was a man from Chicago who spoke with practiced gravity about alarming conditions and family members' consistent reports of concern. He presented photographs of a cluttered room. They were real photos of a room in my house, the spare bedroom where I stored medical supplies, and yes, it was cluttered, because when you're managing terminal COPD care, you accumulate nebulizer parts and backup oxygen tubing and cases of nutritional supplements. He presented an unsigned statement from a neighbor who said she'd heard raised voices. He presented the narrative Valerie had spent years constructing. The drinking, the isolation, the temper, the prescription selling. Then Miriam stood up. If you've never been in a courtroom when the entire temperature of the room changes, I'll tell you what it feels like. It feels like the air pressure drops, like everyone takes a slightly deeper breath at the same time. Miriam entered the care documentation binder by binder. She started with the photographs. 1,247 days of meals, before and after. She let the mediator scroll through them. I watched the mediator's expression shift from skepticism to something else. It took about 60 photographs for her jaw to set. By 200, she had stopped scrolling casually. By the time Miriam mentioned the total count, the mediator was looking at Valerie's attorney with an expression I can only describe as the face of someone realizing they've been lied to professionally. Then, Miriam entered the VA fraud records, the redirected deposits, the address change, the $68,000. She entered the forged beneficiary change on the life insurance policy. She entered Jordan's statement about the bribery attempt. She entered Darnell Price's testimony, and Darnell sat in that witness chair and said, in a voice as steady as a man who has held dying people's hands for a living, "Mr. Okonkwo provided care I would trust for my own father. I visited that home twice weekly and never once saw anything but dignity and devotion." Valerie's attorney asked for a sidebar. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses she kept removing and replacing, denied it and said, "I want this on the record. And if you're listening to this and you've ever been invisible, if you've ever been the one who shows up when there's no camera, no praise, no inheritance to protect, I need you to hear this. You are not a fool for caring, but you would be a fool not to document. Love is not enough in a courtroom. Evidence is." Then Miriam presented the final piece, the letter, my father's letter. The hospice chaplain had given it to me the day of the funeral. He'd slid an envelope into my hand after the service and whispered, "Your father asked me to hold this until it was safe. He knew what she was doing." I hadn't opened it for 2 days. When I did, my chest tightened before I even finished reading the first line. The handwriting was my father's, trembling but unmistakable. The same hand that used to sign my permission slips for school, the same hand that used to grip a basketball in the driveway. It was dated 6 months before he died. Miriam read it aloud in court. "Raymond is the only one who stayed. Valerie told me if I changed my will back, she would make sure I died in a facility where no one knew my name. My son, I am sorry I was too weak to tell you while I could still speak." The handwriting had been authenticated by analysis. It was entered into evidence. The courtroom was silent. Not the silence of people waiting for the next thing. The silence of people absorbing something they wished they hadn't heard. The judge removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes like she was exhausted by human cruelty. Valerie excused herself to the restroom. She didn't come back. Her attorney sat alone at the petitioner's table for another 11 minutes before the judge dismissed the conservatorship petition and directed the court clerk to prepare a criminal referral to the county prosecutor. She ordered the VA fraud records forwarded to the Office of Inspector General. She looked at me over her glasses and said, "Mr. Okonkwo, I'm sorry for your loss, both of them. What happened to Valerie didn't happen all at once. It happened the way ice melts. Slowly, then in pieces, then all at once, there's nothing solid left to stand on." The criminal referral became an active investigation. The VA opened a fraud case. Frank moved out within the week. I heard about that from my Uncle Carlton, who called to say he was sorry, that he should have known, that he felt sick about the things he'd been told. I told him it wasn't his fault. And I meant it. Valerie was convincing. That was her gift. Her salon Instagram went private. Then her clients started posting screenshots. Concerned DMs she'd sent them about her troubled brother. Messages fishing for sympathy and donations disguised as prayer requests. People she'd done hair for began putting the pieces together. The blog posts about being a devoted daughter next to the court documents that were becoming public record. Her community, the one she'd built on the image of a woman who had it all, family values and business success, and a father she adored. That community reassembled the real story without my help. I didn't tell anyone anything. I didn't have to. The truth had its own momentum. The call that stays with me came 3 weeks after the hearing. Valerie's daughter, my niece Keisha, 22 years old, called me on a Sunday evening. Her voice was small. She said, "Uncle Raymond, was any of what Mom told us true?" I sat on my porch and I listened to the sound of traffic on the street, and I said, "I think you should read the court filing, sweetheart, and then call me back if you want to talk." She didn't call back for 2 months. When she did, she was crying. I let her cry. I didn't say anything cruel about her mother. That's not my job. My job was always just to tell the truth and let it do its own work. Valerie tried to reach me. First through texts that were demanding, then confused, then bargaining. She'd split the insurance, she'd repay the VA money, she'd make it right. Then pleading. Each message landed on a phone I checked once a day, and each one was met with the same thing. Nothing. Silence. The same silence she'd given me for years between her quarterly visits with the photographer. I didn't block her. I just didn't respond. And I think that was worse for her than anything I could have said, because silence from someone you've wronged is a mirror, and you can't argue with a mirror. The last I heard, the salon was struggling, clients leaving. A lease renewal she couldn't negotiate alone because Frank had handled the business finances. Her Instagram, when it briefly went public again, showed a woman in a half-empty salon with bad lighting. No photographer, no hashtags. I didn't feel joy looking at that. I want to be honest about that. I didn't feel joy. I felt the particular hollowness of watching something you used to love become something you don't recognize. My father's room is empty now. The oxygen concentrator is gone. The hospital bed was picked up by the medical supply company on a Thursday morning. 2 men carried it out through the front door and loaded it onto a truck and drove away, and the room was just a room again. Bare walls, carpet with indentations where the bed legs had pressed down for years. I sat in that room on a Saturday afternoon with the letter in my hands, not reading it. I'd memorized every word by then, just holding it. The paper was thin, the kind they used to keep at the hospice for patients who wanted to write. Through the window, I could hear my neighbor's kids playing basketball in the driveway. The sound of the ball bouncing on concrete, that particular hollow rhythm, reached through the glass and settled into my chest. And I thought about my father, letting me win in that same driveway 50 years ago. How he made losing look like trying. How he gave me something without me ever knowing it was a gift. I unlocked the filing cabinet. I'd kept it locked for years, out of habit, out of the professional instinct that documentation must be secured. But I unlocked it that afternoon, and I left it open. I took the letter and pressed it flat under a piece of glass and set it on top of the cabinet. Not hidden. Never hidden again. That cabinet had been my habit, then my fortress, then my weapon. Now it was just furniture, with a letter on top, in a house where the truth didn't need protecting anymore. I want to say something about what this cost me, and what it taught me, because I think there are people listening who need to hear it from someone who's been where they are. There's a term psychologists use called caregiver exploitation syndrome. It describes what happens when the person providing the most care receives the least recognition, while other family members extract financial and emotional resources from the caregiving situation. Studies show that approximately 68% of family caregivers report receiving no financial help from siblings, and nearly 40% report that another family member actively interfered with or undermined their caregiving. Those numbers aren't abstractions to me. They're my Tuesday afternoons and my 4:45 alarms and my filing cabinet. What I learned is this. There's a difference between generosity and self-erasure. Generosity is giving because you choose to. Self-erasure is giving because you've forgotten you have a choice. I spent years being invisible because I thought visibility was vanity. I thought asking for help was weakness. I thought the work itself was enough, that someone would eventually see it, that the truth would speak for itself. The truth doesn't speak for itself. The truth needs evidence, and a lawyer, and 1,247 photographs, and a letter from a dying man who was too afraid to speak while he was alive. I didn't win. Winning implies there was a game I wanted to play. I survived, and my father's dignity survived, and the truth survived. And sometimes that's all you get, and it has to be enough. It's spring in Cleveland now. The air has that particular quality it gets in April. Not warm yet, but promising warmth, carrying the smell of wet earth and the faint sweetness of something starting to bloom 2 streets over. I sit on my porch in the mornings with coffee. Darnell stops by sometimes. We don't talk about the case, or the hearing, or Valerie. We talk about the Cavaliers, or his daughter's college applications, or the raised bed garden I'm thinking about building in the backyard. We sit in a silence that doesn't need filling, the kind of silence that only exists between 2 people who went through something together and came out the other side. I think about my father every day. Not the sick version. The version with the basketball. The version who let me win. If you made it this far, I want to hear from you. Tell me where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments. And tell me this, because I genuinely want to know. What would you do if you found out a family member was planning your punishment while you were too busy caregiving to notice? Would you have waited as long as I did? Would you have opened that filing cabinet sooner? I think about that sometimes. Whether I should have acted faster. Whether the years of silence were patience or just fear wearing patience's clothes. I don't have the answer, but I think the question matters. If this story meant something to you, if you recognized any of it, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this, and the people living them need to know they're not alone. Like this one, so it reaches someone who needs it tonight. And if you're sitting in a house right now with a filing cabinet of your own, literal or otherwise, I want you to know something my father tried to tell me at the end, in the only way he could, with trembling handwriting on hospice paper tucked into a chaplain's envelope. You stayed. And that matters, even when no one says it, especially then.